Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Heritage Village. I'd like to welcome you to Speaking of History, a Coastal Living edition. My name is Heather Culligan, and I'm the operations manager here at Heritage Village. And I'm so glad you've decided to join us today. We're going to talk about coastal living at Heritage Village, and who is we? You already know me, but I'm happy to say that our newest staff member will join us today. Her name is Naomi Durakos-Mucci, and she is our new curator of collections. And Naomi joined us in March and has hit the ground running, tackling everything from our museum collection to hurricane preparation, certainly, to historic preservation and exhibits, which we'll talk about that in a little bit today. Naomi is originally from Pinellas County, which is exciting, but she's also spent time in North Carolina and most recently Colorado. So we're excited to have her as part of our team, and I'm happy to have her as one of my team members today at Speaking of History. So coastal living at Heritage Village. If you're familiar with the Speaking of History lecture series, you know that we often spend time talking about the history of other areas or places in the county, which is understandable because we have so much history here. And we have so many things to share, and we're quite lucky in that way, I would say. But occasionally, I think it's important to bring it back home, right here to Heritage Village, because we have some great things happening here. From our buildings, to our galleries, to our archives, to our museum collection, we have a lot of history to share. And sometimes we have brand new history to share with everyone, and that's what I'm really excited about today. Heritage Village is proud to announce that the Gulf of Mexico Sponge Warehouse will open for the first time at the Country Jubilee, October 28th. And in preparation for that opening, Naomi and I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about the Sponge Warehouse and how it fits into the stories we already tell at Heritage Village. I'm going to share what coastal living means to us at Heritage Village, how we interpret the history associated with coastal living, and the buildings that we currently have here at Heritage Village that tie into that theme. And of course, the Sponge Warehouse fits perfectly into the theme of coastal living. I'm going to talk about the building's history, its purpose and contributions to coastal living history, and how the building made it here in the first place. And then Naomi, our wonderful curator, will then take over and share what she's been busy doing here since March. From the interior restoration to the new exhibit, she's overseen it all and worked with our fantastic team of volunteers to get this project done and to ensure our visitors have a great experience in the Sponge Warehouse. So let's get started. Heritage Village includes 33 historic structures and features on 21 acres. Each structure has its own history, when it was built, who lived there, who used it, how it's changed over time, how the building fits in with architectural history and style, when it was moved here, and why. And all of that is included in one part of our interpretation of the structure here at Heritage Village. It arguably tends to be the easiest part of interpretation depending on the building. I say that because one can usually, determine where it came from, who built it, and why, although we do have structures here that we're not really sure about any of that. But there's also a second part to interpretation that can be a little more challenging. And that second part is this. What does the structure say about the culture, the norms, the industries, and lifestyles of the time? How does it reflect what was important or crucial to survival at that point in history? And when you have 33 structures to interpret, how do you make sense of all of them for your visitors? How do you put it together to tell a story? And how do you make it fun? And that's where interpretive themes come in. We utilize 4 major themes here at Heritage Village to interpret our buildings and share our stories with our visitors. And those themes are community life, agriculture, tourism, and coastal living. These themes emerged naturally given the history of Pinellas County and also the collection of structures that have found their way here to Heritage Village. Each structure fits into one of these themes. The history of each structure tells us its purpose, which I mentioned earlier. The people who used it, its function for existing, tells us the role it played in history. These roles or stories can then be grouped with other similar stories to form a theme. Now, if this is sounding a little tedious and a little too detailed, you're right, it completely is. But I share it with you to emphasize that while our themes come naturally to us, it takes time and research for us to ensure that we're interpreting our structures to the best of our ability, that we're telling our visitors the true histories of our structures and therefore the history of Pinellas County. You may be thinking, though, that can structures fit into the different themes that I just mentioned? You're absolutely right. This is not a one-size-fits-all scheme by any means. Some structures can tell different stories, and personally, I think that makes it really fun. Why? Because then we have an opportunity to tell multiple stories and histories to our visitors using the same resource. And the beach cottage is a perfect example of that. It currently houses the gift shop, which is operated by the Pinellas County Historical Society, and it has an interpretive sign out front to share its history, and we currently group it in the tourism theme. For obvious reasons. It reflects early beach tourism with small vacation cottages that dotted the coast. The small vacation cottages eventually gave way to hotels and condos, but initially beach tourism and vacation looked like our little cottage right here. But if you think about it, the beach cottage also fits into coastal living. At least I think it does. And we'll dive into coastal living theme in a second. Pun not intended on that. But the latter part of the theme overlaps with tourism. And the coast is really what makes Pinellas County so intriguing to tourists and our residents. So while Heritage Village boasts 4 well-defined themes, there's still fluidity in there to allow us to be true to the history of our structures, to provide visitors with a multi-layered approach to history, and to reflect the complex nature of our county's history, and so much more. So at this point, well, I'd love to go into further all of our different themes. We're only going to focus on coastal living today, so let's go ahead. When I talk about coastal living, I honestly think of palm trees and the beach. I think of this lady right here having a blast at the beach, and I think that's probably because I'm not from Florida, so we'll just chalk that up. That's what I think of when I think of coastal living. But I've learned so much more, and that coastal living embodies a lot more. Coastal living is a theme that comes forward in the earliest histories of Pinellas County. It explores the ways in which the coastal waters have served as a haven, as a life-sustaining force, a source of profit, and a place of respite and relaxation for the people who lived here. Now we're going to fly through Pinellas history. This is going to be a really fast tour and hitting the highlights of coastal living. So I apologize that we can't go more in depth, but I really wanted to show you how coastal living has been crucial and constant throughout our history. The earliest residents of the area lived in small kin-based groups that tended to be nomadic, and they would, when they did sort of gather, they would gather around water sources such as springs, and also areas that had a lot of rocks so they could make tools. Native American cultures later evolved, and they started to create permanent settlements, which was unlike the early settlers who were, or the early inhabitants, excuse me, that were more nomadic. But their settlements for the Native Americans were permanent and also around the water sources, which makes sense. And for the Native Americans, they started to use shellfish as a source of food, and it became a significant part of their diet. And interestingly, the mounds that you may have seen before they were destroyed, a lot of them were made of discarded shell from the early Native Americans. And some of these maps that you'll see, these are from our collection here at Heritage Village. When Spanish explorers arrived in the 16th century, the area was inhabited by the Tocobaga tribe. The Tocobaga people also ate shellfish and fish from the bay and the freshwater streams around them. For them, the coast provided a life-sustaining force and a haven. Now, archaeologists believe that the center or the town for the Tocobaga was around Safety Harbor, which is a beautiful part of Pinellas County. And we know that it provides beautiful views of the bay, but it's also an area protected by the geography, the water that surrounds it. As we move through history, we start to see new groups move into the Pinellas Peninsula area. These included displaced Creek Indians, which later become the Seminole tribe, Cuban fishermen, and runaway slaves. Cuban fishermen set up fish camps along the coast, and many runaway slaves joined the Cuban fishermen in these fish camps to work and process fish. Unfortunately, raids conducted by the US government in the early 1820s, which is the date of this map that you see here, it led to the destruction of the camps and the capture of an estimated 300 runaway slaves and the fleeing of many coastal settlers at the time. But again, you see the coast serving as a food source and a center and a home for these early people on the peninsula. Now this handsome gentleman, I'm sure you're familiar with him. This is Ode Philippe, and he was one of the earlier settlers to arrive to the peninsula. He was supposedly of French descent, and he came here by way of Charleston, South Carolina, and he settled in the area of Safety Harbor, a very popular place. However, at this time, few settlers, keep in mind, were here between the 1840s and about the 1870s, late 1870s. There were, of course, early pioneers such as the McMullins and other pioneer families. But overall, there were very few families here. In fact, I've seen a statistic in my reading and my research that pops up a lot. Historians estimate that about 50 families lived here prior to the Civil War. So that's about 1860. And even after the Civil War, that number was still fewer. So again, we're talking about a very, very small community here at the time. But oftentimes, the people who were here, that were living here near the coast, they lived near the coast for sustenance, for food, and they were fishing, and they were also farming. During this time period, waterways served as the main connection to the other settlements and outposts. I love this picture. This is an early ferry picture from our collection here at Heritage Village. The waterways really served as the highways or roadways of the time. And if you think about it, the interior of the peninsula would have been very thick with vegetation, so it would have made it difficult to travel that way, so they used the waterways. Getting products in and out of the area would have relied on individuals with shipping companies or ferries like this person. So once again, you see the coast providing a source for sustenance, but also a source for transportation. And keep in mind that the first white settlers weren't the first ones to use the waterways for transportation. The early inhabitants and the Native Americans would have used the waterways in the same way, and they would have created dugout canoes that you may have seen at area museums. Beginning in the 1870s, the sponge industry became a significant part of the economy and culture here on the peninsula. Early spongers, primarily from Key West and the Bahamas, harvested sponges using a long pole and hook to retrieve the sponges from the ocean floor. In the 1880s, John Chaney with the Rock Island Company hired John Kokoris, a Greek immigrant, to improve productivity. He recruited Greek spongers and adopted existing sponging methods already successful and common in Greece. This included motorized sponge boats and the introduction of sponge diving suits with the iconic sponging helmet that you see there in the photo, and we actually have one in the collection, which is pretty neat. Now, at the turn of the century, we start to see commercial fishing becoming a strong industry for the area. With improved transportation at the turn of the century, with the railroad and automobiles, the shipment of fish from the coastal areas becomes much more easier for fishermen and small business owners. We also see the rise of the boat building industry, from sponge boats to commercial fishing to recreational boats. The Pinellas Peninsula became the center of boat building. And of course, Pinellas County becomes the home to some of the best and well-known boat builders in the world. And we'll talk about Clark Mills in just a second. And then we return back to my palm trees and the beach, and these lovely ladies having a great time. We all know that beginning in the 1880s, this area was touted as the most beautiful place to relax and restore your mental and physical health. From the 1880s to the post-World War II boom to tourism today, the coastal waters of Pinellas draw millions of tourists every year. Tourism is obviously extremely important to Pinellas, but as we discussed before, these themes often overlap. Tourism exists because of the beautiful weather, the pristine beaches that we have, and all the luxuries that the coastal waters have to offer. So I would argue that coastal living is certainly directly linked to the boom of tourism. So as you reflect on my extremely brief history of coastal living in Pinellas, you begin to see a pattern. The people of Pinellas, from its earliest settlers to business owners and boat builders, they utilized the water as a source of livelihood. Whether it was food, transportation, exchange of goods, the coastal waters created a culture and lifestyle that's really unique to Pinellas County. And this is why it's one of the major themes we discuss at Heritage Village. So how, do we interpret coastal living at Heritage Village? We currently have 3 structures to address the theme. We have the Boyer Cottage, the McKay Creek Boat Shop, and of course the Sponge Warehouse. And we did not purposely paint them all white. I noticed that when I was putting this together. I thought, all of our structures in the same theme are the same color. That was not intentional. The Boyer Cottage was built by Joshua and Mary Boyer near what is today Boyer Street and Pinellas Avenue, north in Tarpon Springs. Joshua and Mary were married in April 1877 and were living in this one-room cottage by 1878, so therefore it was built sometime in between that period. Now you remember I mentioned that at this time there were very few settlers in the area and it was very secluded. On the left there you'll see a copy of their marriage certificate from 1877, and this is an early map, and the yellow arrow shows where the Boyer Cottage would have looked or would have been built initially. Prior to marrying Joshua, Mary and her father, Alexander Ormond, came to Tarpon Springs in 1876 from North Carolina. They lived in a small cabin near the intersection of MLK Jr. Drive and Pinellas Avenue, so just south of where the Boyer Cottage would eventually be built. And a little bit later, maybe a year or so, 1877, Mary meets Joshua, and he's traveling in the area along the Anclote River. And Joshua is a native of Nassau, and he's on a trip from Key West. Now, we talked about the coastal waters being a source of transportation earlier, and it was very common for people to travel from Key West, Cuba, the Bahamas, to this area of the Pinellas Peninsula. So Joshua arrives in this area, and he meets Mary. And he just decides, you know what, I should probably stick around. I guess he likes Mary a lot. And he's going to construct a permanent home where that yellow arrow is. He cultivated about 40 acres at the time. And he later builds a stable that is reportedly becomes the first hotel in the area. So that's a fun fact about Joshua. The structure that Mary and Joshua built was intended as a temporary structure. And in this photo, you see additions that are along the side. Those, of course, were not original. The original structure is 14 by 14, or a very spacious 280 square feet. It's a one-room with a high-pitched wood shingle roof. The Boyer Cottage is an excellent example of early wood frame vernacular buildings that existed between Texas all the way over to Florida. So that's pretty an expansive area to find buildings like this. It includes board and batten siding and tongue and groove wood floors, which are just in brilliant condition given how old it is. And while it's extremely primitive, I say it has a lot of charm, and it's actually one of my favorite buildings here at Heritage Village. Joshua Boyer left accounts of his life with Mary along the Anclote River in their home, including the fact that Mary is said to have been the one to name the area Tarpon Springs. And while details of what Mary actually said differ depending on the newspaper that you read, it does appear that Mary suggested Tarpon Springs because of the large amount of tarpon in the surrounding waterways. Now, I learned earlier this week at a preservation summit in Tarpon that there was a rumor that it was actually mullet in the area, and that is not true. So if you've heard that rumor, it's not true. It was actually tarpon, and that's why she named it Tarpon Springs. In fact, this area, the Anclote River, was known to be the best place for fishing tarpon, according to an 1878 article in the Sunland Tribune. So this is an excellent example and reference to how coastal waterways provided food and sustenance to early settlers. Now, Joshua also mentions other settlements such as Seaside and Clearwater Harbor, which of course later becomes Clearwater. And these were places that people traveled to obtain goods. And of course, the people that lived in these settlements and outposts, they would have used the waterways to get these goods to the settlers. So again, you still see the theme of transportation. The 1880 census provides excellent details about the Boyers and the cottage. At the time, there were 4 people living in the Boyer cottage. Now remember, it's 280 square feet. So that's a lot of together time, I think. In the home was Alexander Ormond. This was Mary's father, remember. You have Joshua and Mary, and then you have Joshua's sister, Elizabeth. So could you imagine having your father-in-law live with you in 280 square feet all the time? Importantly, Joshua's occupation is listed as sailor, and this is an image from the 1880 census. So he's a sailor, again, the theme of coastal living, and we believe at this time Joshua operated a ferry, and he also operated a coach to Tampa, which would have been quite the trip back in the day. And then we mentioned that later he opens up the livery stable. So he's a very busy man. So the history of the cottage goes on to include additions, which you see, a few moves, and even a fire before it arrives to Heritage Village. The Boyers eventually move on as well. They move to the other coast. But it's the cottage's early history that really ties it to the coastal living theme. Early settlers like the Boyers depended on the water for absolutely everything. And one-room structures were what the early settlers lived in. Like the Boyers, they fed on the abundance of fish in the rivers, the tarpon. They built businesses that depended on the water. They traveled long distances to get goods. But there was still a sense of community, even among the very few settlers. And this is what we try to convey using this small 280 square foot building. And the McKay Creek Boat Shop. This is the second building we use to interpret coastal living. It opened in October of 2015, so 2 years ago. It's hit its 2-year anniversary. And this building is unique in that it was built on site at Heritage Village. The construction of the boat shop was made possible by partnerships between the county and private organizations, such as Pinellas County Historical Society, the Clearwater Yacht Club, Ed Hoffman Architects, and Profke Construction. What's truly amazing is that volunteers built the 1,400 square foot building, and you can see some of them hoisting up that wall for us. The boat shop features 2 rooms. One currently is filled with boats and other sailing artifacts. The other is currently awaiting a new exhibit and a boat building area. The building was designed to reflect the boat shop of Clark Mills, who you see, he's the handsome fellow in this photo. And he was a local boat builder and designer of the Optimus Pram. The Optimus Pram is uniquely designed to be used by young sailors in a water version of the soapbox derby. The current display reflects a later time period in coastal living history. So we're talking about 1940s to the present. This is a key point in time when the coastal waters of Pinellas drew visitors for recreational activities like sport fishing and sailing. And so you have events like the first Florida Pram Regatta in 1948. And you have the introduction of the windmill, another Clark Mills designed boat, which you see on the right. And there's a lot more. There are a lot more stories to tell during this time period. And we tell them in the boat shop. And it's really, like I mentioned, the early history of these Pinellas boat builders who were so talented and so just known around the world, and really what coastal living means in the modern era, what I would call the modern era. And finally, which I know you've all been waiting for, is the sponge warehouse. The Gulf of Mexico Sponge Warehouse is significant in the areas of industry, ethnic heritage, and architecture for its association with the development of the sponging industry in Tarpon Springs. This is a 1-story structure and it was located initially on Roosevelt Boulevard up in Tarpon Springs. But early maps actually indicate that Roosevelt Boulevard was formerly known as Lake Boulevard, and the address of it then would have been 203 Lake Boulevard, and I have a map in our later slide to show you exactly where it was located. This is also a frame vernacular structure like the Boyer Cottage, and structures like this that were built between 1910 and 1930 are really the most common structures in the Tarpon Springs area. The term vernacular in architecture refers to structures built with local materials and local labor, usually without any plans. The frame vernacular style is indicative of the working class nature of the district, of the Tarpon Springs district, which has been historically occupied by families directly or indirectly associated with the sponge industry. Now, the sponge warehouse was once owned by Drosos Alahoussos, which you see here on the left, and he's a Greek immigrant who came through Ellis Island with his sister from the Mediterranean island of Kalymnos in 1916. Of the four brothers, there's Michael, Drosos, Emmanuel, and Elias. All but Elias eventually settle in America. And while Drosos ran the family sponging business out of Philadelphia, Michael and Emmanuel worked in the Alahoussos sponging warehouse in Tarpon Springs, and they also worked as merchants and butchers. Here's the map that I mentioned earlier. We believe that Drosos built the sponge warehouse about 1930. Although we will admit that an exhaustive review of city records from Tarpon Springs and Pinellas County have failed to provide documentation that it was for sure 1930, but I'll tell you why we believe it's 1930. The building is seen on the 1930 Sanborn fire insurance maps, but not on the 1919 Sanborn map, and this is a photograph of the 1919 map, and the arrow is where it would have existed. The area where the warehouse is currently located was actually part of a lake in 1919, and that area was dredged for a canal project in the 1920s, and it's upon that filled land that the sponge warehouse now sits. As I mentioned, Drosos spent his time between Tarpon Springs and Philadelphia. He made several trips a year between the two areas, purchasing sponges at the sponge exchange, after which workers would clip and bale the sponges and then ship them up to Philadelphia. At some point, the paths of Alahoussos and the Kuselius families cross in Pennsylvania. Michael Kuselius and his father, George, had a sponge business in Pittsburgh, and so they would have known each other through business. The Kuselius family became aware of Drosos' death in 1957, and so they purchased the sponge warehouse from his estate at that time. Now, the Kuselius family operated the Gulf of Mexico Sponge Company from 1957 until it moved here in 2004, so that's a really long time. The company imported spongers from Europe, and during the Vietnam War, they helped supply the U.S. government's General Services Administration with sponges. According to the Kuselius family, the structure has not been altered since they took possession of it. So when you see interior pictures of it and when you eventually see it in person, it really hasn't been altered since then, so which is really fantastic. Michael Kuselius was president of the Tarpon Springs Sponge Exchange from 1972 and 1976, and he was also responsible for arranging the sale of the sponge exchange to the Pappas family, who currently owns it. George and Michael Kuselius helped bring spongers to Tarpon Springs from Kalymnos also. Michael especially made sure that they were taken care of when they arrived. He was president of a society in Tarpon Springs, which was a mutual aid society that was there for social networking, to provide health insurance, help find employment for people, to raise money for people back in Kalymnos, as well as to keep the island's traditions alive in Tarpon Springs, which is still important today. Like I said, the building was moved here in 2004, along with the original front concrete steps. And that's what it looked like. Now, what happened between 2004 and 2017, excuse me? Between 2004 and 2015, we did several things to preserve this building and maintain it. That includes painting and washing it. installing an access ramp along the side, working on the doors, repairing and painting the signs. You see one of them above the door. It was in rough shape when it got here. And installing the flexi-pave path so people could actually walk up to the door, and worked on the shutters on the exterior of the building. Also during that time, Heritage Village worked with an exhibit designer to come up with a plan for the inside. And it's a beautiful plan, but unfortunately, with limited staff and resources at the time, we couldn't implement it. But it did provide excellent feedback for us and ideas about the future. In 2016, we updated the electrical, installed new lights, and replaced a center beam that had been just destroyed by termites. And then, of course, we tinted it for termites, a regular thing here in Florida. So that was the preparation work up until Naomi joined us in March. So I'm going to hand it over to her and let her talk about what she's been busy doing and show you the fun pictures of the restoration.
Hi, everybody. Heather already mentioned a little bit what I'm going to talk about, but here's some more pictures of what the sponge warehouse looked like when it first arrived at Heritage Village. In order to move the building here, they took off the roof as well as the pitch so that it could fit underneath all the power lines as it moved across. So afterwards, trades crews from the county repitched the roof, and then they actually replaced it with a new roof. As I was doing research prepping this week for this presentation, I learned that the original roof was actually recycled, so we don't have that anymore, unfortunately. And here's another exterior shot of what the windows looked like. And so in addition to the new roof, some of their priorities were to seal the building from the elements better. So that included a new foundation. On the exterior walls, they replaced rotted wood, sanded, primed, and painted the entire building. In addition to that, you guys are going to be exhausted by the time I'm done talking about all the work that was done. The building didn't come quite level to us, so they had to level out the building as well when it came here. And so, yeah, sealing up the exterior was one of their main priorities. I have to say, when I first saw the sponge warehouse when I started here 7 months ago, it did not look this bad, but my first impression was, oh my gosh, this thing needs so much work. And I can't imagine what I would have thought when I first walked through this space if it would have come to us like this. So this is what the inside of the building looked like when it first moved here. This picture on the left is actually a shot of what they did to stabilize the interior of the structure when they moved here. You'll see in some other slides how the interior configuration works, but essentially along that row of beams, there's a series of racks that they would have stored and sorted the sponges in. So that's supporting it. And this is that rotted beam with all the termite damage that Heather mentioned that we replaced. And that beam is pretty much the entire support for the attic in the space. So it was crucial that we replaced it because through the restoration process, we've had county workers and our own volunteers walking around in that attic space as well to do repairs. So as she mentioned, the building was riddled with termite damage as well as rot to a lot of the wood. So here is a picture on the left of some of our volunteers who are replacing rotted flooring. And in addition to that flooring, the door that slides across had a lot of rot. And they were great. Under the direction of Richard Samay, our lead preservation volunteer, our two volunteers over here cut out the portions of the flooring that were rotted and then replaced it with all new flooring in that spot, as well as building a new threshold. If you would have asked me how to do it, I would have looked at you like, I don't know, throw some wood in there. But these guys are great. Their knowledge has been invaluable throughout the process. Another big project was where I mentioned that area of containers. This whole portion of the building swayed. It was kind of just tied in to the attic. And so Richard and Greg, two of our great volunteers, sweated it out through the summer months, completely stabilizing half of the structure. So what they did was they retrofitted in a series of beams to replace this portion of the warehouse. And then these are false fronts for the area, but they also created a series of these screened false fronts for us that are completely removable. So they allow us to still access that portion of the space while also being able to keep our visitors from going underneath there, maybe catching a stray nail to the head that might be in one of the boards that are coming through, or vandalizing it. And I'm not sure if it was one of my other photos, but when the building originally came to us, it had black tar paper on the interior of all the walls. So our teams have also stripped all that paper to expose the pine walls behind the structure. With the exception of the new roof and the few patches that have been done, I mean, it's pretty much the entire original building that's here, which is pretty impressive given its age, that much of the building has survived. I can say that there are easily 20 or 30 of these false fronts that they created. They worked really hard. They're all custom size. No one is the same size. So they did a lot of great detailed work throughout the summer on that. Also this summer/fall, we worked on cleaning the interior of the sponge warehouse. When I first walked into it on my first day here, and I had my oh my gosh moment, it was dank and dark and mildewy and nasty, and it was just not a space that you wanted to be inside. So here's some pictures of us cleaning out the sponge warehouse. We took out all of those false front screens, which you can see stacked against the building, and then as well as a series of screens, or essentially room dividers, that they would have used within the warehouse to flex how much storage space they needed between the size sponges. So all of the broken ones that we received with the building are now stored in the attic, and the ones that are existing are going to be part of the exhibit in the space. In addition to that work, I don't know, there is probably 30 bags of sponges in the sponge warehouse that are for the exhibit. But those all needed to be sorted and rebagged. So bless our volunteers, they got in there with new, 50-gallon trash bags, and to the best of our ability, because none of us are experts on the I don't know how many variety of sponges there are. We were like, well, these look alike, so we sorted and rebagged them to the best of our ability. So during this process as well, after the building was cleaned out, we used a product called D2, which I know sounds very scary, but it's not. It's biodegradable, environmentally friendly. It is what we use to clean the exterior of all of our structures when we do painting. And so our guys were great. They got in there, we scrubbed every wall and surface in there, and it no longer smelled dank and musty and mildewy. As you can imagine, 70, 80 years worth of old sponges being stored in there, it had a particular funk to it, and just cleaning it did wonders to improve the space. So after the building was cleaned out, our crew kept at it. So here's some pictures of our guys working. You can see Richard down there with a bucket in his hand. And that is a mixture that he came up with that helps darken the new wood to match the existing wood in the structure. That involves rusty nails and some juju and vinegar and all kinds of good stuff. And our volunteers were great. They painted it on any new wood, got a layer of that, I think it's called Boracare, layered on it. And as you can see, this vinyl plastic is over a beam that runs along that wall, and it has writing on it in Sharpie that came with the building, so we really wanted to protect that part of the history during this cleaning process. So after the building was swept and washed, it then got a layer of more secret sauce, This was a mixture of linseed oil and turpentine that helps seal in the wood, prevent it from rot, as well as a little bit of protection from termites. So there you can see in the corner, getting every little crack and crevice. We sprayed it with a garden sprayer and then had to go back over with a paintbrush across every surface in the building. And then the picture on the left is two of our volunteers measuring and hanging plexiglass to go over that writing. We didn't want people to vandalize it in the future. And it's also great because that plexi acts as a structural component as well for those false fronts. So that's a little bit about what's been done in the building. That was about a 2-week process, cleaning the structure out and really getting it to where it didn't feel like a health hazard in there. Now I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about the exhibit process. So this is our current sponging exhibit in the main gallery. I took it for a point of reference for myself to see what we were doing. And as you can tell, there's not much. We have a model sponge boat, some postcards, as well as the sponge press and the diving suit. Unfortunately, I don't feel comfortable moving that diving suit into the unconditioned warehouse. I just feel like the rubber will decay faster than in an air-conditioned setting. But one of the things I like to do when I work on exhibits is spend some time in this space that the exhibit's actually going to take place in. So I went over to the warehouse and started thinking, okay, what's the usable space do I have? And then within that usable space, which is actually 800 square feet, what are the stories that we want to tell? What are the artifacts that we have to convey that history? So thinking about the physical and intellectual parameters of the space. So we are very fortunate to have some great partners at Tarpon Springs who lent us 3 text panels that they had already created for an exhibit up there. And then I replicated 1 panel over here on the left to try and blend in with them. So it's really great. Taking a look at the exterior signage for the building covers a lot of great history about the history of the building itself, the Alahus family, and early sponge diving as well. The text panels that we got from Tarpon Springs are great because they tie in that cultural element about the traditions of helmet making and cycles of work on the boat, the process of going sponge fishing and drying the sponges and getting them to market. One of the things that I felt was missing within this space that we did just briefly was a very quick and dirty recap of the history of sponge diving in the area, starting with the Bahamian fishermen up till the blight in the 1970s, and then bringing it present day, mentioning that Tarpon, while sponging is not the vital industry there, that legacy of sponging is so integral to their tourist economy and how they market themselves. So really trying to bring that narrative full circle. And then another component of this space is the artifacts that we have as well. So last week was really exciting for us. We moved the sponge press from out of the gallery and into the sponge warehouse. The county's trades crew did a great job. They partially disassembled the press for us. As you can see, strapped it to a forklift and toted it over without breaking anything. And they got it back together with no spare parts left over at the end. So that's a win. In addition to the sponge press, we have a lot of great artifacts. I apologize I didn't bring any for you. They're actually in the building awaiting to be staged for the exhibit. But a lot of the artifacts we have are geared towards the industry itself. Shears to cut the sponges to size, hooks that they would have used to pull it up, rigging from the boats. And so the warehouse itself is this really interesting intersection between culture and industry. So I'm hoping in the next few weeks as we make the final preparations to really marry those two narratives together. So this is a little sneak peek of the exhibit process itself. This is another one of our great volunteers. bravely going into the slightly shaky area, and he's hanging some plastic netting to create these false fronts that would convey the scale of the warehouse. When it was initially in use, it wouldn't have had these screens in front of it, but once again, we had to make decisions relating to the safety of our visitors, but they would have been filled with sponges. And that's one of the things we want to convey to people. This was a major industry, and boy, did they pull a lot of sponges out of the ocean for a very long time. And this is the last little teaser pics that I have for you guys. This is our sponge press in the space. I really do have to say our volunteers are great. Last week after we moved the press, I said, all right, guys, I have 2 last-minute projects for you to do. One was to build me a series of shelves to actually have something to put the artifacts on. And they recreated these shelves based off of existing shelves in the space. So everything that we did was to try and replicate and blend in the new work with the existing work as closely as possible. And then they also built me a reading rail around the sponge press so I can just get a little bit more space for some interpretation within the space as well. So I think that is about all I have to say, aside from saying some very special thank yous to our partners involved. One would be Tina Bukovalis, who's been our point of contact up in Tarpon Springs. She helped us get those panels that we were able to reproduce. She really worked as a liaison within the community. Before myself or Heather were even here to cultivate artifacts, put us in touch with people who could do oral history interviews, and I could go on and on about all the work she's done on behalf of Heritage Village. I'd also like to point out some of our amazing volunteers who have worked on the project, even though I don't see them in the room. So as I mentioned before, Richard Samay, our lead preservation volunteer, put in I don't know how many hours, and he worked closely with Greg Krause to do a lot of that interior structural work. Additionally, Kent Ward, Ron Sacra, Vince Mueller, Fred Bizzell, Ron Bilby, Don Hudson, Daryl Stargell, Lon Mackey, and then Daniel Peacock have all just put in gobs and gobs and gobs of hours to get this space ready over the past 7 months. It's really remarkable how much can get done in that amount of time, and to think it's all primarily volunteer labor. Really the only thing that we're paying for this exhibit has been the text panels, which is absolutely remarkable. So look forward to the Jubilee, everyone. It's going to be really great, and you can go through the space and see the exhibit in its entirety. So thank you. And Heather and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Do we have questions? Any questions about the restoration or anything else that you've been itching to ask? Oh, yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that there are 33 structures out there now?
Structures and features, yep. Which I actually just have to amend that because we got a recent edition on Friday, actually. Oh, yeah. So now I guess it's 34. The new one that arrived is a tower, actually, from the Gandy Bridge, the original Gandy Bridge built in 1924. Instead of tearing it down, the county moved it here, and it showed up Friday morning. So we're excited, and that will also be open. Well, it'll be up and installed for the Country Jubilee. So we have 2 new things to share with everybody. So yeah. Anything else? Great. Well, thank you all so much, and don't forget to join us next month to learn about Publix.